Greetings all, and welcome to my full build of the 1/72nd scale Tamiya FW190 A3. So this is the second FW190 I've put together as part of an ongoing build series, and it's also the second Luftwaffe aircraft I've ever airbrushed. So if you want to see how I went with this model, and find out if this Tamiya kit is the kind you can take off the shelf and shake and bake, then stick around as I build this kit. As always, I give all of the parts a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any oil or grime from the sprues, and once they're all dry, I cut out the fuselage halves, instrument panel sections of sprue, the engine tub and gearbox, cockpit side panels, wing upper halves, wheel wells, cockpit tub, rear canopy area, the joystick, and the lower wings. Any excess plastic on these parts are cleaned up using a knife, and then I use some Revell Contactor Professional to assemble various sub-assemblies for painting. For my first sub-assembly, I glue the wheel well details to the upper wing halves, and then set those aside to dry. Next I assembled the two side panel details to the cockpit tub along with the seat and joystick, and attached the rear cockpit canopy sliding area to the left fuselage. The last assembly I added was the engine, which consisted of a polycap stuck into the gearbox, which was then glued into the engine tub. All of the parts in this kit seemed to fit really well together and had some pretty nice details. I then mixed together 2 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver, 2 drops of acrylic thinners, and 3 drops of a black primer into my airbrush, and sprayed the upper and lower wing sections, the 2 fuselage halves, cockpit assembly, engine assembly, and the instrument panel, which I'd left attached to some sprue to use as a handle. I do a few light passes on all of these parts, and then left the primer aside for a few hours to fully cure. Next I applied a thin coat of Vallejo Model Color Flat White to create some pre-shaded highlights on the various parts. In a few spots I got a little bit too close and applied the paint too fast, which caused a bit of spider webbing, but for the most part this step went without any issues. The wheel well was then sprayed a coat of Vallejo Model Air RLM02, although I applied it too quickly and lightly, causing unintentionally saturated and faded appearance, though I decided to experiment and leave it looking that way and see how it looked after some weathering. For the cockpit area and instrument panels, I sprayed them a few light passes of Vallejo Model Air RLM66 until the colour was nice and uniform. The engine assembly was then sprayed with Vallejo Model Air Aluminium, and once that was applied, I set aside my airbrush for the moment and used a brush to apply several coats of the Model Air RLM02 on the upper wing interior parts, and for the inside walls of the engine cowling. To paint the raised cockpit and wheel well details, I first used some Vallejo Model Color Yellow to pick out the base of the throttle, and then I used a dry brushing technique to dab it onto some of the sidewall switches. The same technique was then used to apply some vermilion red onto the sidewalls. Decals are included for the instrument panel, but I decided to try painting it instead by hand, starting with some red and yellow for the switches and the border of some of the dials. I then used some Vallejo Model Color Flat Black to paint the top of the control stick, and then dabbed away the excess and once again dry brushed it lightly onto some of the switches and panels on the walls. For the oxygen dial, I applied a tiny dot of Vallejo Model Air RLM23 Blue on the instrument panel as a base, and once the RLM02 was dry, I painted the engine gearbox with flat black in several layers, along with the cannon details in the wheel well, before carefully painting the recessed dials on the instrument panel with the flat black. Model Color Flat White was used for both the side panels, and once the black had dried, was dry brushed over the instrument panel to add detail to all of the gauges. On some of the dials, I also dabbed it a little bit in the middle. After the cannons received a few more coats of the black, the barrels were painted with Vallejo Model Air gunmetal, and for the seat cushion, I painted it a base coat of Vallejo Model Color US Field Drab, and while it dried, I dry brushed some Tamiya XF16 flat aluminium along the edges of the seat, the cockpit floor, raised panels on the sidewalls, and the raised details in the wheel well to create some metal chipping on the exposed raised edges. I then got out some Vallejo Model Color Buff and dry brushed the seat cushion to give it a heavily faded leather look. After a bit more metal chipping, I then glued the upper and lower wing halves together and gave the cockpit tub, sidewalls and engine a coat of Tamiya black panel accent to give them some grime, create some shading, and help to highlight details. On the wheel wells, I decided to further experiment with some dark brown panel wash instead of black, since it was a lighter colour and to give it more of a dirty appearance. Once the panel liner had dried, I then used a brush or cotton bud soaked in enamel thinners to remove the excess panel liner from raised areas, making the effect less dark, and helping the panel liner to flow more into just the gaps, making the details pop. Although I wasn't going to use the instrument dial decals in the kit, I decided to use the included seatbelt ones. I cut them out, stuck them in some warm water, and while waiting for them to come loose of the transfer paper, I carefully dabbed some Vallejo gloss varnish onto all of the dials to give them a shiny glass-like appearance. The seatbelt decal was then slid onto the seat, where it nicely conformed to the shape, and was given a coat of Tamiya decal adhesive to help it stick down. With all of the interior work now done, the instrument panel was finally cut out of the sprue and glued to the cockpit tub, and then I glued the two fuselage halves together, clamped them with a bulldog clip, and added the engine tub and cockpit tub. By now the wing halves had fully bonded, so I glued them to the underside of the fuselage halve and held them in place. I found the fit of all the parts was exceptional, and there were very few gaps on this model, definitely a lot less than on the Airfix kit. The upper cowling part, landing gear covers and horizontal stabilizers were then cut out, cleaned of any seam lines and excess sprue with a file, and then attached to the model. I didn't glue the landing gear doors into place, however, so that I could both use them as a mask for the wheel well, while also painting them with the fuselage, and when done I would glue them in the open position. The model was now ready for some Vallejo water-based putty to fill in the very few gaps that existed between the fuselage halves, the wing root and fuselage joint, and a few light spots on the wing and engine cowling. Once the putty had been applied, I used a damp finger to wipe away the excess so that it would only remain in the recessed gaps. Once dry, I then sanded away any remaining putty and seam lines, and any lost panel lines were then carefully rescored with a Tamiya scribing tool. The sanding process leaves a fair bit of dust, so I blew this off using my airbrush, and once the engine and cockpit had been masked with some white tack, I began to apply some Vallejo gloss black primer over the entire exterior. I aimed to apply the primer gradually by spraying it in several quick passes, moving the model around and then repeating the process until the entire upper surface had a good uniform and gloss black finish. I initially tried holding onto the model using the white tack areas on the fuselage, but found it stuck to my gloves too much, though I found a cocktail stick was very useful for holding the model down while spraying the upper surface. Once the upper surface had been painted, I then let the primer harden for a couple of hours, before then turning the model over and repeating the process, applying the primer to the underside of the aircraft until the model had a nice gloss black finish that was ready to receive some paint. Once the primer had been applied and given 12 hours to fully cure, I decided to approach painting a little bit differently to my previous Airfix 190 by applying a base coat of Vallejo Model Air aluminium. This was mixed in the airbrush with a ratio of 5 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver, 8 drops of Vallejo acrylic thinners, and 4 drops of paint. I then applied it first in the middle of all of the panels, on both the upper and lower surface of the model, and then did several unifying passes. The aluminium base coat would theoretically make the camouflage colours a bit more vibrant, make applying the yellow markings easier, and I had originally planned to also try using it to create some metal chipping using some liquid mask. Since, however, I had to hold onto the right wingtip of the model while painting, I had to give the paint a few minutes to dry before then holding onto the opposite wing and applying the paint in the areas I'd been holding onto. Fortunately though, this didn't take too long as acrylics dry very quickly. Originally, I decided to try experimenting with liquid masks to create some chipping, although I later on decided against this. I still, however, applied it by dabbing some sponge into the Vallejo liquid mask, and then applying it onto the walkway, leading edges of the wing, and around the cockpit and engine in areas that are likely to receive metal chipping. Next, I decided to experiment with some pre-shading by mixing 3 drops of Vallejo Model Color Flat Black with 3 drops of Vallejo Flow Improver, and then carefully spraying this along all of the panel lines. I wasn't too worried about being super precise, as the effect is supposed to be subtle and very faded, and despite the airbrush clogging, it was pretty easy to do, although I think in future builds I may experiment with some post-shading instead. After all the panel lines had been highlighted, I also sprayed some light random patterning over all the main panels to create a little bit of variation of the paint when it's applied on the top. Learning from my experience airbrushing my Airfix 190, I decided to mask off around where I would be applying the yellow markings, which would be the rudder and the bottom of the engine cowling for the scheme I was doing. By masking around the yellow marked areas, it would prevent any overspray, which would later on lead to discoloration of the lighter camouflage colours. For the yellow, I mixed up 3 drops of Vallejo Flow Improver, 1 drop of Vallejo Thinner, and 8 drops of Vallejo Model Air RLM04 Yellow, and sprayed it lightly onto the rudder and the cowling. Much like brush painting, I find yellow a very tricky colour to airbrush. It's very transparent, so you have to very slowly and carefully build layers up, avoiding making the paint too thick as it can run very easily. I've found that by applying the yellow bands and markings before adding the main camouflage and masking them off rather than applying them after the camouflage is applied, means that they don't end up with a raised lip or edge, and instead appear level and blend a bit more with the rest of the paint job, which is pretty important in this smaller scale. I then gave the yellow some time to dry, and in the meantime cut out, cleaned up, and masked the canopy using some masking tape for sharp edges, and Vallejo liquid mask to fill the rest of the canopy in. At the time, I was working on the Airfix Eduard and Tamiya kits, so I decided to paint their canopies together to avoid wasting paint. I first paint them a coat of RLM66 for their interior grey colours, and once that paint had dried, I then applied some RLM74 over the top, since all of these aircraft had the same colour in that area based on their marking guides. Returning to painting the main fuselage and wings, I removed the masking tape surrounding the yellow markings, and then added it back over the top of the yellow bands to mask them off, and began painting the underside of the aircraft with AK Interactive's RLM76 Variation 1, mixed to a ratio of 4 drops of Vallejo Acrylic Flow Improver, 3 drops of AK Interactive's Acrylic Thinners, and 4 drops of the paint. Initially, I sprayed an overall thin coat in several passes over the entire underside of the model, relying on the previous layers of black to achieve some variation and shading effects, but I probably built up too many layers of the RLM76 as the pre-shading effect was a bit too weak for my liking. On the fuselage and tail, I switched back to my previous technique I'd used on the Airfix 190 by painting the middle of the panel lines for some highlighted areas, before then doing a unifying pass over the whole model to blend it all together. This was better, but still a little bit too subtle for what I was hoping for, so as mentioned, I'll try some post-shading to get some panel variation in the future. Moving on to the upper surface camouflage pattern, I don't really like masking, and I wanted to have some organic and soft looking shapes in the camouflage, like in reference photos of some 190s. So I decided to only mask off the underside of the wings, the fuselage, horizontal stabilizers, as well as the thin line around the wing root to protect them from overspray, as the camouflage is usually sharp edged on these parts, unlike on the fuselage and tail where it blends together. I started painting the upper surface camo with the lightest colour first, mixing 5 drops of Vallejo Acrylic Flow Improver, 4 drops of AK Interactive Acrylic Thinners, and 4 drops of RLM75. I then applied the outlines of the camouflage shape and gradually filled them in with a few passes. Along the fuselage, the lines are quite thin, so I came in closer with less pressure on the trigger and did a few rough lines around the tail and engine cowling and filled them in. I did another few passes over all of the RLM75 areas to make them stronger and a bit more uniform until I was happy with the results. Once again, I reckon a bit of post-shading for these colours would be better than trying the pre-shading, as they're already quite dark and the black didn't really show through. For the darker colour, I mix the same ratios, but this time use RLM74 and repeat the process, carefully outlining and filling in the empty spaces, and adding soft squiggles along the fuselage based on the marking guide. As I mentioned in my Airfix video, the contrast between these colours is a bit low, so I did another pass with the lighter RLM75. Satisfied enough with the main camouflage, I started very carefully adding the mottling shapes to the fuselage side. I realised though that the masking tape was in the way, so I removed it, and found that much like with the Airfix kit, there was a clear mark where the Tamiya masking tape had been, so after adding a few more modelled shapes until I was out of paint, I then switched back to RLM76 and used some paper to cover over the wing area and carefully sprayed some over the fuselage to blend it all together. As well as cleaning up the overspray from the camouflage and neatening up and feathering the edges of the camo pattern slightly, doing it at this stage gave me a chance to see how a subtle layer of 76 over the top of the modelling looked, and I thought it looked really awesome. So I returned to the mottling afterwards and added all of the missing shapes with RLM 74 and 75 following the marking guide. Apart from being careful and easing off the pressure a bit, I didn't really do anything too special. I just very carefully added the little shapes I wanted to. My airbrush is the Hasing HS80, which has a 0.3mm needle, so it seems to do both fine detail and larger areas of 1/72nd scale kits pretty well. I have had a few people recommend taking off the outer cover to get even closer and finer detail, which is something I may try in the future, but for this scheme I was pleased enough with how the airbrush performed outside of one or two clogs. Once all the modelling was then applied, I sprayed a very light amount of 76 over the top of it to give it a faded and soft appearance, as though only a thin amount of paint had been applied like in real life, and with that the aircraft had been painted. Stupidly though, I forgot I'd used the maskol instead of the chipping fluid as I'd done previously, and attempted to remove some of the paint from the walkway by using water. This obviously didn't really work, and I also decided I didn't feel like further experimenting as I was happy with the paint job, so I decided to make no further attempt to remove any of the Vallejo liquid mask and instead move on to varnishing. I removed the blue tack and masking tape from the yellow markings in the engine, and then sprayed the entire model in a coat of Vallejo acrylic gloss varnish to help seal the paint job and also prep the model for decals. In my admittedly slightly limited experience of Tamiya kits, I've always found their decals are very bad, especially in terms of silvering, so a gloss coat at this stage is very important to try and prevent this. As mentioned, it also helps seal the paint job, which is very important when using acrylics as they scratch quite easily, and it also meant that I wouldn't accidentally remove any paint with the liquid mask. Once applied, I gave the gloss varnish 12 hours to fully cure, before then applying the decals. To apply the decals, I first cut the ones out I would need from the main sheet, and stick them in some warm water, wait for a few seconds until they start to come loose of the paper, and then apply some water to the model where the decals are to go, and slide them off the paper using either my fingers or a brush. The only decal I really struggled to apply though was the white tail stripe, which I felt was a bit too fine for me and my level of experience to attempt to mask up an airbrush earlier, but fortunately with a bit of fiddling this decal did eventually go into place. The print quality of the decals is really good, although they are very thick. Once all of the decals had been applied, I added some Vallejo decal softener to try and combat the thickness of the decals by helping them to soften into all of the surface details of the model. To further help the decals conform and show the surface detail, as well as helping them to stick down, I then applied some Tamiya decal adhesive. This is my usual combo for applying decals, and while it definitely helped, it sort of makes the decals about as good quality as cartograph decals that haven't received the decal softener. You could now see that some of the panel lines were softly showing through, but they didn't really look as painted on or as thin as other brands of decals normally do. So much like with my older BF109 G6 I built from Tamiya, I found the decals once again to be a bit of a disappointment, although unlike in that kit, it wasn't as big of an issue, as I'd purposely chosen a scheme that didn't require the large complex decals like the one with the eagle head. I gave the decals at least 12 hours to fully cure and settle, before then applying a coat of matte varnish to help blend the finish of the decals and paint job together, making it look like they were painted on with the same finish, and also helping to protect them from the upcoming weathering process. I cut out the smaller parts which I'd left on the sprue during painting of the main aircraft, which included the various parts of the landing gear, main wheels, the cooling fan, propeller and spinner, the headrest, cannon barrels, and the pitot tube. I glued the struts to the landing gear doors and used a sanding file to clean up the seam lines from these various parts, before then assembling the propeller, headrest, and gluing the pitot tube onto the wing. All of these finer parts were given a coat of Vallejo acrylic gloss black primer, which I probably could have done earlier while I primed the rest of the model before painting it, but oh well, those are notes for next time. After giving the primer 12 hours to fully cure, the main landing gear and tail wheel were then glued to the fuselage, along with the pilot's stepladder and the cannon barrels. Once the landing gear was in place and solid, I glued the main wheels to them, and then began painting the details. First I painted some Vallejo Model Air RLM 66 onto the headrest, followed by some Vallejo Model Air RLM 4 for the inner surface of the main landing gear, the struts, and the tail wheel. The tyres and main wheel hubs were then painted with Vallejo model colour flat black, while the propeller received several coats of AK Interactive acrylic RLM 70. The pitot tube and ladder were painted AK RLM 76 Variation 1 to match the camouflage on the underside of the aircraft, and I did a few more coats of these various colours until all the parts were nice and solid. The upper surface of the pitot tube was painted AK Interactive RLM 75 to match the camouflage colours, and once all the control tabs and stepladder markings had been painted with Vallejo Vermilion Red, the cover on the wheel struts had been painted model colour saddle brown, and the wheels had been neatened up. I gave the model another light coat of matte varnish to protect the paint on these additional parts from scratching, and moved on to weathering. I decided to experiment a fair bit with this kit, starting with creating some superficial scratches by mixing RLM 75 and 74 with a little bit of white, and then using a fine brush to dry brush and stipple it along areas I wanted to create some chipping. These included the walkway areas along the wing, around the access hatches for the engine, and on the leading edges of the wings. By using a mix of the camouflage colour and white, you can create some very subtle scratches that look like the paint has been slightly damaged, but it's a lot more subtle than if you'd used straight up aluminium, and a bit more realistic in my opinion. I definitely though could have used a bit less paint and made a more subtle effect, but after it dried I was really happy with how it turned out. I still used some Vallejo Model Air aluminium to dry brush some deeper metal chips, especially around the walkway, on the leading edges of the wings, the edges of the propeller blades, the leading edge of the engine cowling, and for some chipping on the underside of the wings, landing gear, and the access hatches. I gave the aluminium and the lighter chips a few hours to fully dry, and in the meantime I painted the cannon barrels and engine exhaust heat shield with Vallejo Model Air Gunmetal Metallic, and the wingtip nav lights were given a base coat of Vallejo Model Air RLM 1 Silver. I also experimented for the first time using Abteilung oil paints for some weathering, which I'd originally picked up for some armoured projects but decided to try out on this aircraft. I used some engine grease for exhaust stains and some streaks, as well as buff for some dirt on the tyres, and I did plan to use some white for some discoloration, but in the end decided not to use it. I've heard it's best to let the oil drain a little bit from the paints for around about 2 hours, so I put them out on a piece of cardboard and set them aside, and in the meantime went over some of the larger metal chips I'd created using the aircraft's camouflage colours to reduce how much metal chipping there was, and also create a subtle faded effect and some sharper corners, making the paint wear look a little bit more toned down and realistic. Next, I applied some Tamiya dark brown enamel panel wash to all of the recessed details on the aircraft to create some post shading, highlight all of the panel details, and add a subtle amount of grime. For a darker effect, I still used black panel accent, especially around the engine, exhaust, and landing gear areas where oil and fluids could potentially leak, and also along the edges of all the control surfaces to give them some added depth. Once the panel washes had dried, I then dipped a brush and a cotton bud in some X20 enamel thinners, and used them to rub away and blend the excess to create a more subtle effect. This was the first time I'd used predominantly dark brown to apply the main wash, and I really loved the effect on the lighter underside, but found with the darker upper surface camouflage colours it blended in a little bit too much. By now the oil paints had lost most of their glossy oil, so I mixed them with a tiny bit of AK odourless thinners, and used a brush to stipple the engine grease oil paint around the exhausts, some of the access hatches, and the shell ejector ports, before then streaking it backwards. The oil paints were really easy to blend and streak using the odourless thinners, and they produced a really nice matte faded finish, although I found the engine grime colour was a bit too brown for some areas, so I used some Tamiya XF1 flat black enamel paint in a very similar fashion, instead using X20 enamel thinners to blend it. The oil and the enamel paints didn't really blend together, and I think that the oils were much nicer to blend, but I was still pretty happy with the effects. In the future, I may get some blacker oil paints for experimenting with exhaust stains, and also for those heavier oil streaks often on radial engines. I then mixed up the buff oil with some odourless thinners, and applied it onto all of the wheels, the landing gear doors, and the base of the rudder to create a subtle dirt effect. I also experimented with adding a few dots of buff onto the wings, and then streaking it backwards for some variation and a bit of discoloration. The thinner was then used to remove the excess from the landing gear and the exhaust area, and once I'd added and blended some layers of the oil and the enamel flat black around the exhausts, I was pretty happy with the result. With the weathering done, I finally neatened up the front canopy framework by using a cocktail stick to carefully scratch away any excess acrylic paint, and then I removed the mask from the main canopy and the cockpit area. I really should have done this a lot sooner, however, as the Tamiya tape came off pretty easy from the canopy, but either the Vallejo liquid mask or the blue tack left some very bad marks on the inside of the canopy. I tried using some blue tack and a damp cotton bud to remove the excess, and it did help, but there were still some ever so slightly visible marks. I decided in the end to bring out some deluxe materials looks like glass, and using a brush, applied some onto both the inside and outside surface of the clear parts. This was then left for 24 hours to cure, and afterwards I found that it definitely made a big improvement to all of the clear parts. While the looks like glass cured, however, I painted another coat of RLM66 on the headrest, and painted the glare shield with a few coats of flat black, and also dabbed some onto the ejector port and cannon barrels for some added effects for the gun smoke. I put the decal for the headrest in some water, and while I waited for it to come loose, I painted the cushion on the headrest with a little bit of flat black. The decal was then slid onto the headrest and given some Tamiya decal adhesive to help it stick down. Unfortunately though, I accidentally did this with the Eduard 190's headrest, which, as you will see, did not fit the Tamiya canopy. Yeah, be careful when you're working on two of the same or very similar types of aircraft at once, but from different kit brands. Anyway, so the glare shield was finished off by using chocolate brown for the trim, and then I dry brushed it with some Vallejo model colour light brown to give it a faded leathery look. Once the glare shield was dry, I carefully removed the sprue attachment points from the front canopy and glued it into place using some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue. When I attempted to glue the headrest in place and it didn't fit, I realised my mistake. I quickly painted the Tamiya part, and then after re-gluing the front windshield to make it fit a bit more snugly, I then glued the headrest to the main canopy and added the Eduard kit's warning decal to it and gave it a dab of Tamiya decal adhesive. I find the Deluxe Material Odorless CA glue works really excellently for gluing clear parts, as it doesn't tend to fog up and still offers a good strong, albeit slightly brittle bond. The final touches to finish up the model were to paint the left nav light with Tamiya Clear Green, the right nav light with Tamiya Clear Red, and to add the early single antenna wire leading from the tail to the canopy using some AK Interactive Mega Thin rubber rigging wire. I had a bit of trouble getting it to stick to the canopy initially, and found that regular cheap CA glue worked a lot better than the odorless CA glue, but once I got it into place, I left it to dry for a few minutes, and then added a dob of the CA glue to the tail, fitted the canopy in place, and stretched the wire till it reached the tail and cut away the excess. I probably made the rigging wire a little bit too tight, but I managed to lengthen the wire slightly by stretching it very gently, and once this was done, the Tamiya FW190 A-3 was finally completed. And here you can see the finished model. So I'm really pleased with how this one turned out, especially with the airbrushing modelling, which I was attempting for the first time. It was a lot of fun to build and experiment with as well, and I really liked how the oil paints were to streak and fade, and the more subtle effects created by using white paint mixed with the base colour, rather than just straight up aluminium for the chipping. I also think that the looks like glass did a really great job improving the canopies. It's nice to have a great short-nosed early 190 variant available in 1/72nd scale, though I'm sure many people would like to see Tamiya introduce an equally good A8 tooling, or the overlooked A4, A5 and A6 variants. Apart from the decals being thick and even with the gloss coat still silvered a tiny bit, I would say this is a pretty fantastic kit. There are some really nice details, especially in the cockpit and wheel wells. I love the details for all of the access hatches and hinges around the engine area, and compared to the Airfix kit, I would say the Tamiya 190 is pretty much on par in terms of details, maybe with an upper hand, and it definitely beats the Airfix kit in terms of ease of assembly and quality of the molds, though obviously being different versions of the 190, if you want a later model A8 like the Airfix kit, then the Tamiya kit isn't really a better choice. For around 20 AUD, I think it's a really well priced kit, and it comes with 3 scheme choices, which, as long as you have some products to handle the decals with, are usable, and it's definitely a great kit for beginners to learn and build, and an easy, fun little mojo build kit for those more experienced to grab off the shelf and just shake and bake. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and the rest of my series on building the Tamiya 190 A3. If you did, please be sure to leave a like, and feel free to leave any friendly suggestions for how I can improve, and any questions you have in the comments. A massive thank you to my wonderful patrons who made my airbrushing booth possible. If you want to help fund my build and stop motion projects, please consider joining my Patreon. The link will be in the description. All going well, I should have the first part of my Eduard 190 A5 build coming out next week, along with another F4U Corsair inbox review. Thanks again for watching, and until the next video, take care, model on, and shake and bake.
Yeah.
What?
Shake and bake.